Good afternoon and welcome to today's coffee table, or rather coffee break webinar, Global Rights Modeling. I'm Brian O'Leary, Executive Director of the Book Industry Study Group. I want to welcome you to today's talk. This is actually the third in a four-part series on rights and royalties that are all part of this coffee break series, kind of a 30-minute overview of a single aspect of a particular part of the industry. We expect to continue to talk about rights. It's been a busy summer for us on that front already, but we'll continue to talk about them in the fall. We have a white paper currently in work research being conducted by Giant Steps Media Technology Strategies, with a report expected by the end of September, and we'll be doing rollouts of that in October and November. We also will be adding some programming in that regard from some of our member companies. This actually follows the Rights Bill of Materials webinar that we did on July 16th. That recording is available on the BISG website, as are recordings of all of our webinars. This session will be recorded and will be available for playback later. Or if you want to refer to a colleague who's missed it, they can also register and obtain a copy there. Today's speaker today, again, is Paul Gore of FADEL. Paul's been really generous with his time in talking about his thoughts about how to better organize rights and royalty information for the business. He's been working in this part of the industry for quite a long time and has a perspective, particularly as you'll hear today, with respect to organization around ISBN and some of its limitations. Paul, without any further ado, I'd love to be able to introduce you and also turn this over to you.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Thank you all. I hope you can hear me okay.
You're good, Paul. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you. Today I'll be taking us through another step of this coffee break series on transforming rights and royalty operations. And what the purpose of this series is really to identify, better or best practices to add efficiency, accuracy, transparency to royalty processing at publishers. So there's a lot of transformation going on in how publishing products are made, sold, and distributed. And these discussions are really all about the type of things that need to be done in order to accommodate that. Today, we're going to be looking at some of the elements needed for what I'm calling a global rights model, and how it can drive flexibility from both content creation and in streamlining compensation for the authors and the contributors of the works. So without further ado, I'll jump right in. What is a global rights model? And at a high level, it's a taxonomy that works for all types of contents within a publishing organization. So it's not the same as an Onyx record. An Onyx record, which in the book industry is related to a book, which has rich information about the book itself, including rights. But this is really intended to be a live view of the rights acquired from the perspective of the rights that have been acquired, which may be a superset of a book. It may be the rights that have been acquired that allow you to create a book as a publisher, or it may be the rights for content elements that go inside of a book. The idea here is that it's a consistent rights model that defines that. So some of the goals of having a global rights model and of working within a publishing organization with a global rights model is it gives a consistent approach that will help streamline the move to digital content. So it'll give you knowledge of what rights you have and what options you have when moving to digital. Obviously it'll need to be quite flexible because the definition of what you can and can't do is something that is evolving over time. So it'll be very important for it to be an extensible model that can be adapted over time or extended in order to satisfy new needs. As I first mentioned, it is a framework to cover all types of content rights, not just the book, but actually the work above the book and the content inside the book. So another main goal of this would be that it's machine readable, so that it can be usable both within and outside of specific publishers and platforms, to ultimately enable the interchange of information between publishers. This is not necessarily the interchange platform as much as it's really the standard of how we talk about what rights we have. And of course, it should be mapped to open standards wherever available and appropriate. So if we call something a territory in Onyx, we should be calling it consistently within a global rights model, so that there's compatibility between the different standards. Key benefits are having this in place will really help give some flexibility during the product planning and creation, so that you keep an eye on what rights you should be getting and should have, and you have a clean way of identifying those rights, so that when you do acquire them, you can do so more quickly and drive your products to market more quickly. Another key benefit is that by having visibility into your rights while creating content, while assembling content, you cannot waste time, money, and resources to do a late stage rights check or clearance process to make sure that you have all the rights that you need. The idea here is have a rights model in place, make that available at the time you're doing content creation, and then you can speed your whole process and reduce your costs of clearance later, because you're clearing as you go. And then at the end, the idea is that you'll establish a true system of record for your rights. So your global rights would be housed ideally in a single place that gives a single view of what the rights are that you have for all the different levels of content. Okay. So some of the core elements and of a global rights model, and this is basic stuff here, but some of the core elements include things like, what is the content that that's the subject matter that we're talking about? Maybe it's a title or a work. It may be something more broad, like a property or an edition, or it may be something more detailed, such as an asset. But the idea here is to identify the type of content that's subject to the rights that we're describing. Then there are different types of rights. Usage, reuse, and transfer rights are your basic rights. These are the rights to produce products based on the work or based on the what you've acquired or what you've licensed, or the opportunity to create new derivative product out of that, or to sell or transact sub-rights or subsidiary rights for other purposes to other publishers or other entities. And then when you're describing those rights, the rights typically govern all aspects of how you may create product and how you may leverage a product. So of course it will describe, in publishing, it would be your formats and product types. So in the traditional sense, you would have elements like, is it a hardcover or an ebook, type format? Do you have the rights to produce them, and what rights do you have to produce them? Time is a major factor. Over what time period do you have the rights? Do you have a limit on the number of uses that you can have? And that may be both at the content side. I'm licensed to use this image in 10,000 printings, or I may have made an arrangement with an author in order to print 20,000 copies of a particular title based on this, as opposed to royalty calculations, which would be more than the count. Territory, geography, where that content can be leveraged. Industry, channel, and platform is something that may change from publisher to publisher, or from type of business to type of business. The idea here is to have a consistent way of describing the channels that you market to and whether or not you have the rights in order for this product or content to go into those markets. Exclusivity is also a factor, especially when you're selling rights, because once you've sold those rights, they're no longer available to be sold to others. And there may be other very specialized restrictions on use that need to be recorded in your rights model. I need author approval in order to put this book into this particular topic area. Some very, very specific things may need to be captured as part of this. And finally, when working on asset rights, it may be that the assets that are being acquired, for example, perhaps there's a chart or an image, but it can only be used in certain subject matter in a certain product line. And those contextualized constraints may also apply. So I can use this asset, but only in this book. I can use this asset, but only in this product line. So those are part of all of this information together is what makes up your rights model. And if you combine them in various ways, then that really is the description of what you can and cannot do with the licenses that you've acquired. Now, the foundation for rights transactions, our view on that is that your agreements or the deals that you strike with your rights holders are these building blocks for the rights that you have. They define all the elements of the rights model. They define who owns it and what type of compensation are they receiving for it. Are they getting a fee outright? Are they getting a fee for a quantity? Are they getting royalties paid over time against advances, etc.? All of that is defined by the agreements that are put in place in this. So it's a very foundational piece of what rights do you have. And agreements need to be aware of relationships between multiple rights holders or multiple owners. So you may have two different rights holders where you need to acquire all the rights from each of the two, or you may have two rights holders where one owns a particular region and another owns a different region. So there needs to be smart ways to combine agreements to make sure that you understand the rights that have been acquired. Ultimately, compensation, and now I'm talking specifically about things like royalty systems and calculating royalties. Ideally, you want to map your sales and usage transactions back to the rights model to support the compensation. Traditionally, the mapping is really back to the ISBN, yet most agreements are not written at the ISBN level, they're written at the level of the work, which is really where the rights are acquired. So the idea is, how do you connect your global rights to the transactions that are taking place? Clearly, in some examples here are your traditional products, print, ebook, etc. They can usually be directly linked via the work, format, language. That's information about the books. It's typically in the Onyx record or in your title record that you can use in order to map back to what rights needed to be acquired in order to produce those books. Custom products are very well supported by bills of material which combine multiple products together, or rights bill of materials, as was covered in one of our previous sessions. In very complex models, for example, in education products or other aggregation of content, there may be very complex content models where you may use your DAM system or asset management system in order to connect the product sales that are taking place back to the content elements that are inside the product that you're selling. So you need to know that relationship between the content and the element, the item that's being sold. Finally, subscription sales are not typically tied to the product that you're selling. They're actually tied to a subscription platform, where the platform in turn manages what products or content elements, what rights are actually being sold or used from that platform. And we had a separate session on subscriptions as well to cover that. So there's a lot of different ways to get at this. The idea is that ultimately you want to get your royalty transactions mapped up to the rights, because that's really where the agreements are. So, and that's where, one of the best practices that we want to point out is that you really want to have this rights model inherent to all the different types of transactions that are taking place for rights, royalties, permissions, because that will give you the ability to meet the current and future demands. If you're aligned only to the ISBN or product, or perhaps a fixed right model that does not scale, then it tends to limit the amount of flexibility that you have, or create a lot of work on the back end in order to support changing business models and transforming publishing models. So ultimately, by leveraging the global rights model, you'd be having a global model in place, along with authoring tools at the content level, can be a very effective way to manage rights availability, so that as you're producing new products, you can ensure that the content elements of the new products that are being produced are conforming to the rights goals or the rights strategy that you may have for the overall product. And done effectively, you can make that linkage at real time while authoring, so that you can clear as you go, or acquire rights, or prepare to acquire rights as part of that upfront process. Now, at this point, there are no true universal standards within publishing for a global rights model. However, there are some standards that can be mapped to, that can really help to connect the dots. Now, there is a BISG taxonomy pilot that's starting to use some of the foundational elements to manage one piece of this, which is rights requests, sort of permission requests, and granting of permission requests. It's a start. There is another BISG pilot having to do with automation of publisher to publisher, and that will also do quite well to leverage a consistent taxonomy, a consistent way to work between publishers. And then there are other standards, such as ODRL, which goes back quite a few years, but has been explored as a transaction standard for this, that may be able to represent many different types of rights transactions of buying and selling and transacting against rights. So I went through that rather quickly, but I'll pause here for questions and see if any of the group, or Brian, if you've received any questions that you'd like to ask.
Yeah, we have a few questions to start with. Excuse me, and if you're interested, please do add your thoughts or questions in the question box that's part of the control panel that you see generally on the right side of your screen. One question was just a broad-based question of how widespread is the adoption of a global rights model? Is this a problem for a lot of publishers, for some publishers, for certain classes? Is it a brand new idea?
It does vary from publisher to publisher. So within a single publisher, there are some publishers who are making great strides towards having standards within their organization. And there is limited uptake between publishers for transacting certain types of transactions conforming to a model. But regrettably, there's also a lot of publishers that have different standards in place across different geographies or across different domains. The content might be handled completely differently than, for example, the actual royalty processing, for the books itself, or you may have different divisions that operate in different ways. So clearly, if it's the first step is to make consistency within a publisher, and then to have targeted areas between publishers that you can transact cleanly.
And I think that one of the things I just want to build on from your prior slide, we are looking at and working with two publishers who are trading partners for rights in and rights out on a fairly frequent basis, to see if we can't use the taxonomy as a basis for having a better mapping one to the other. That's something we'll probably talk a little bit about in August when we have our last in this series.
Yes.
A question that we also received, does a taxonomy model typically yield a boilerplate rights document? Or is that something that you have to kind of set up in the systems implementations that you might do?
Our experience is that we typically configure that within the implementations. I would like very much to conform to an industry document. I don't think we're that close to it. It's typically done on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, so it's
there is a lot of common ground between publishers, though.
There is. So you see a lot of different types of agreements, but without talking about the specifics, there's probably more overlap than we might imagine.
Yes, in my view, I believe there is a lot of overlap between publishers.
The one question was how are business needs for rights management evolving? You kind of alluded at the beginning that there's a shifting marketplace. What are the kinds of things that publishers should be aware of, or at least you think might be trends in the business that they'll have to be able to support longer term?
Well, one trend I'm seeing is that there's a lot of unexploited rights where not having a firm handle on what rights are available, for example, to be sold, diminishes the ability to maximize the sales of rights and to maximize on behalf of the author and the publisher. So that's one aspect. Some publishers get it right, but others struggle with that. And I believe that this global rights model is actually an effective tool to understand what rights you have and can be sold. And then with regard to the content pieces, I think there's some really evolutionary opportunities available about changing the nature of how product is assembled and how rights clearance is done as product is assembled. That does not have a lot of uptake at this point, but I see a lot of opportunity there for publishers.
And what happens when maybe established models or systems that publishers have in place don't scale? Maybe they're ISBN related. And what kind of work is required at the back end to meet these evolving needs?
What that tends to cause is a couple of things. One is a lot more work has to go into calculating the compensation for authors. There's manual work that has to be done because systems can't quite do the calculations the way they need to, so things have to be done offline and loaded back in. Or there's a lot of ongoing maintenance work where you get to the end of a cycle, and instead of being able to close and generate statements immediately, you've got to go through a weeks or months long process of getting caught up, making sure all the ISBNs are entered, clearing your suspense, making sure that your systems have been synced up so that you're calculating all the royalties combined. So those tend to be the effects, and they could result in either more work or miscalculations or inaccuracies, at worst case.
So part of the offset of the investment there is essentially not necessarily saving staff costs, but saving the time that staff have to spend doing otherwise avoidable admin, and perhaps then putting them to work on growing revenue or better managing deals. So
that's right.
A follow-up to I asked you a moment ago with respect to yielding a boilerplate rights document. A follow-up question was, is there a boilerplate rights model that a publisher can use to adapt to their needs? And I think there's probably a lot of contracts, either sample or otherwise, floating around. But are you aware of anything that is a standard that you point people to?
I don't have an industry level standard. I think that the work that we're doing with BISG to work on a taxonomy and having consistent rights information is going to really help the industry as a whole.
Thanks. No, I appreciate that. And one thing I might recommend to the Deb Haggerty is asking this question, is to talk to consultants who work in the industry. As an example, Chris Kleeman, who chairs our rights committee, is a consultant for the business. She might be useful, and other folks in that space might be useful in helping you think through what a boilerplate or standard contract for your house would look like. You talked about something that making rights machine readable. Just to drill down a bit, what would make rights machine readable? Is it that taxonomy, agreement on terms, and implementation of those terms?
It's having consistent terms and a taxonomy that can represent those terms in a consistent way.
Great.
So yes.
And you used a number of terms when you did the breakdown of what everybody should be thinking about for collecting information. But one in particular I wanted to question you about, when you were talking about property, title, work, addition, and asset. So what would be can you give me an example of a property? What would a property be?
A property, it's a parallel to a work. It's an intellectual property that you may have acquired that you may have broader rights to, that allow you to produce materials related to that property. So it might not be a work as for example a book, right? It may be a certain image. It may be a branded image that is a property that is owned by another entity that you may have to license in order to use.
So to avoid a Harry Potter example, because it's our most our go-to shorthand, but Moomin Trolls, that they have books, but they also have stuffed animals and television programming, etc. That would be the property.
Yes, potentially.
Yep.
Spider-Man, right? So
I'm gonna have to use Spider-Man next time.
Yes.
It's much cooler than Moomin Trolls.
Yes.
You talked a bit about Onyx, and one thing I just wanted to clarify, I think you and I are on the same page here, but you're not saying that Onyx is not the right resource, but rather that it serves one purpose, but it does not help you when it comes to things like tracking what you've sold or what rights you've acquired, and you need to have a more robust system beyond that to be able to follow that information.
That's right. And as a very back when I was in publishing, as a very early adopter of Onyx, it is an absolutely essential element for publishers to have that information and to have very good information about that describes the books and the products that are going to market. It's the only way folks are going to know what those products are. Now, the rights model is a little different. It sits both above and below Onyx. It sits above it because it's really laying out the rights that you had to acquire in order to produce one or multiple products that you're now representing in Onyx. So that's how it sits above it. It also sits below it because you may have a product you've got a very solid description of in Onyx that is composed of many elements where you've had to acquire rights for those different elements. Your rights model's got to account for things at both levels.
Yeah, so you really have to be almost beginning with the end in mind in setting something up, because you want to be able to capture all those information at all those levels if it's appropriate.
Exactly.
So we have just about a minute left. I was just wondering if you have one thought with respect to global that you want to make sure that everybody walks away from this talk with keeping it in mind.
My main point is that if you go to the rights transformation, the royalty transformation discussions that we've been having, I actually think this is one of the essential building blocks of having, like a living rights royalty permissions platform, that can enable these new business models. I think it is the main building block for this.
Yeah, I might add that if you look at the long arc of the 21st century, rights is when it comes to books, perhaps other media as well, but rights with respect to books are only going to become more global, and so getting ourselves ready for it is an important part of our planning efforts.
Great.
Paul, thank you very much for your time today and for pulling these both this session and the prior two together. I really appreciate it. We're going to be coming back on August 20th with a final, essentially rights mapping versus taxonomy conversation. Before that, we're going to be doing over the next 2 weeks several different sessions related to the Book Industry Study Group's annual meeting, which we moved online. You'll see events next week on the 3rd, 4th, and 6th, as well as on the 11th and the 18th in August. So we'll be dedicating a lot of time to that. I hope I see you at some of those sessions, but if not, we'll certainly see you, Paul, at the on the 20th, and when we wrap up the summer's worth of rights conversations.
Perfect. Thank you.
Right. Thank you again.
Okay. Thanks all.